Here's a claim that's going to sound too simple to be true, and then I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes making sure you believe it anyway. The single biggest difference between someone who gets rich and someone who stays stuck at the same income for a decade isn't intelligence. It isn't connections. It isn't even starting capital. It's decision speed. How fast you can move from I'm thinking about it to I did it. That's the scale. And I want to show you exactly why it matters more than everything else you mind. Because once you see this, you'll start noticing it in every successful person you've ever met. And you'll start noticing his absence in almost everyone who feels stuck, no matter how smart or hardworking they are. Let's start with what slow decision-making actually costs, because most people have never done this math. Say there's a decision in front of you right now, could be starting something, could be raising a price, could be cutting an expense. Doesn't matter what it is. If it takes you 6 months to make that decision instead of 6 days, you didn't just lose 6 months of waiting. You lost 6 months of compounding on whatever that decision would have produced. And unlike money, you cannot get time back at any interest rate. A slow decision isn't a neutral pause. It's an active, ongoing cost charged to you daily, whether you notice it or not. Most people think indecision is safe because nothing bad is happening. Meanwhile, something very bad is happening. Opportunity is aging in real time, and it does not wait for you to feel ready. To make this concrete, think about what 6 months of delay actually means in practical terms, not abstract ones. 6 months is enough time for a competitor to launch the thing you were still thinking about. It's enough time for the market conditions that made your idea attractive to shift entirely. It's enough time for the version of yourself with the energy and conviction to start this has quietly been replaced by a slightly more tired, slightly more doubtful version who's now facing the same decision with less momentum than you've had the day you first thought of it. Delay doesn't preserve your options the way it feels like it does in the moment. It just spends them slowly, in a currency you can't see draining until the balance is already low. So why are most people so slow? I want to break down the 4 reasons, because if you can spot which one is yours, you can start dismantling it today. Reason 1. They're solving for zero risk instead of solving for good odds. There is no such thing as a decision with zero risk. Not staying exactly where you are has risk too. It's just risk you've gotten used to, so it doesn't register as risk anymore. The person who takes 8 months to decide isn't actually eliminating risk during those 8 months. They're just trading a visible risk for an invisible one. The risk of falling further behind while they wait for a guarantee that was never going to arrive. Fast deciders aren't reckless, they're just honest about the fact that certainty isn't on the menu, so they stop ordering it. Reason 2. They're asking too many people for permission. Every person you ask for an opinion before you formed your own is a small transfer of ownership over your decision. Ask 10 people whether you should do the thing, and you'll get 10 different answers filtered through 10 different fears, none of which have to live with the outcome. The fastest deciders I've studied ask very few people, and only people who have actually done the specific thing they're deciding on. Everyone else's opinion is noise dressed up as advice, and noise is the enemy of speed. Reason 3. They're waiting to feel confident before they act, when confidence is actually the result of acting, not the requirement for it. Confidence is built the exact same way muscle is built, through reps under load, not through thinking about the gym. If you wait to feel ready, you will wait forever, because readiness is a feeling that mostly shows up after you've already done the uncomfortable thing a few times. The order isn't feel ready, then act. It's act, then feel ready. People have that sequence backwards their entire lives and wonder why they never seem to catch up. Reason 4, and this is the sneaky one, they're protecting an identity instead of protecting an outcome. Somewhere along the way, a lot of people built an identity around being careful, being the responsible one, being someone who doesn't make impulsive choices. That identity feels safe to protect. But when protecting the identity starts costing you the actual outcome you wanted, you've made a trade you didn't consciously agree to. You can be careful about how you execute a decision. You cannot afford to be careful about whether you decide at all. Reason 5, and this one hides behind good intentions. They're optimizing for the best possible option instead of a good enough option that's available now. There's a difference between wanting to make a smart choice and wanting to make the smartest possible choice out of every option that could theoretically exist, including the ones you haven't found yet and might never find. Chasing the theoretical best option means you're comparing what's actually in front of you against an imaginary alternative that keeps shifting the moment you get close to a decision. The fastest deciders aren't settling for less, they've just accepted that a genuinely good option, taken now, almost always outperforms a hypothetically perfect option that arrives, if it ever arrives at all, 2 years from now after the window that mattered has already closed. Now, here's where I want to be precise, because speed without direction is just recklessness, and I'm not selling you recklessness. Fast decision-making has a structure underneath it, and I want to give you the exact framework the quickest, most successful people I've studied actually use, whether they can articulate it or not. Step 1. They separate reversible decisions from irreversible ones instantly. This is the single highest leverage habit in this entire video, so pay attention. Most decisions in business and money are reversible. You can undo them, adjust them, walk them back with some costs, but not catastrophic costs. A small number of decisions are truly irreversible, the ones that close doors permanently. Fast deciders treat these two categories completely differently. Reversible decisions, they make in minutes, sometimes seconds, because the downside of being wrong is small and correctable. Irreversible decisions, they slow down for, appropriately, because that's where caution actually earns its keep. The mistake almost everyone makes is applying irreversible level caution to reversible level decisions, which means 90% of their hesitation is being spent in exactly the wrong place. Step 2. They set a decision deadline before they start gathering information, not after. If you research a decision with no deadline, the research will expand to fill however much time you give it, indefinitely. Give yourself a real constraint. Decide by Friday. Decide after these 3 conversations, not 30. A deadline forces your brain to prioritize the information that actually matters over the information that just feels productive to collect. Step 3. They define what would have to be true for this to be a bad decision, and then they check if any of those conditions currently exist. This one flips the entire process. Instead of asking what could go wrong, which is an infinite and paralyzing list, you ask what specific things would have to be true right now for this to fail, which is usually a short list of 2 or 3 concrete conditions. If none of those conditions currently exist, you move. This single reframe collapses weeks of anxious spiraling into an afternoon of clear thinking. Step 4. They act on 70% information instead of waiting for 95. This sounds aggressive until you understand the math behind it. The jump from 70% certainty to 95% certainty usually takes exponentially longer than the jump from 0 to 70. You're spending the majority of your decision time chasing a small percentage of additional certainty that, most of the time, wouldn't have changed your decision anyway. Acting as 70% with a ladder, there's no way to do that. We'll have home waiting on mind of only everything with them. Because you get move ahead, so the window. Step 5. And this is the one that makes the other 4 sustainable instead of just a one-time burst of speed. They build in a short, scheduled review point after the decision, instead of either abandoning it the moment it's made or endlessly second-guessing it. Fast deciders aren't fast because they never look back. They're fast because they've separated deciding from monitoring into 2 different mental modes. The decision gets made quickly, on the information available, and then a specific date gets set, 2 weeks out, 30 days out, whatever fits, to actually check how it's going and adjust if needed. This is what makes speed safe instead of careless. You're not committing to being right forever, you're committing to moving now and correcting on a schedule, which is a completely different posture than either freezing up front or refusing to ever revisit a call once it's made. Let me show you what this actually looks like in a real business, not just in theory. Picture a small service business that's stuck around the same revenue for 2 straight years. The owner has a list, a real list of 6 things that could move the number: raising prices, cutting a low-performing service line, hiring a closer, changing the guarantee, testing a new channel, renegotiating a supplier contract. Every single item on that list has been on the list for over a year, not because the owner lacks the resources, because each item sat in the research phase indefinitely, waiting for a certainty that was never going to show up on its own. The moment that owner applies the 4-step framework, something almost boring happens. 5 of those 6 items turn out to be fully reversible. You can always lower a price back down. You can always bring a service line back. You can always adjust a guarantee. Only one item, a long-term supplier contract, was genuinely hard to unwind. So 4 decisions get made in a single week that had been stalled for a year, and the 5th, gets the careful treatment it actually deserved. Revenue doesn't move because the owner suddenly got smarter. It moves because a year of accumulated hesitation got compressed into 7 days of action. That's not a hypothetical outcome. That's what happens mechanically anytime you apply real deadlines to decisions that were never actually irreversible in the first place. Now let's take this out of business for a second, because the same mechanism runs identically in personal finance, just quieter. Picture someone with a decent emergency fund sitting in cash, well past what they actually need for emergencies, who has been meaning to move a portion of it into something that actually grows for close to 2 years. Every few months, the thought resurfaces. They open an app, look at a few options, feel slightly overwhelmed by the number of choices, close the app, and tell themselves they'll look into it properly next weekend. Next weekend rarely comes, not because the decision is actually complicated, but because it was never given a deadline or a defined failure condition. So it just floats indefinitely in the research phase. Run the 5-step framework on it, and the whole thing resolves in under an hour. The decision is almost entirely reversible. Funds can be adjusted or moved back with minor costs. The specific conditions that would make it a bad decision are short and checkable. 70% information is already sitting in their head from 2 years of half-finished research. What was missing was never information. It was a deadline. That single missing ingredient, a deadline, is responsible for more stalled financial decisions than bad information ever is. Now let me address a few objections I know are already forming. But some of my decisions really are complicated. They're not just reversible or not fair. But complicated is not the same as slow by default. Complicated decisions still benefit from a deadline and a defined failure condition. They just might need a slightly longer window, say 2 weeks instead of 2 days. The framework scales. What doesn't scale is open-ended deliberation with no deadline attached, because that's the setting almost everyone defaults to without realizing it. Isn't this just telling people to be impulsive? No, and this distinction matters. Impulsive means acting with no framework and no reflection at all. What I'm describing is the opposite, a repeatable process you run every time. That happens to produce speed as a byproduct of clarity, not as a replacement for it. Impulsive people skip the framework entirely. Fast deciders run the framework so quickly it looks impulsive from the outside, but it isn't. What about big decisions, like leaving a job or a relationship? Those sit closer to the irreversible end, and the framework tells you to slow down there appropriately. The entire point of separating reversible from irreversible is so you know exactly where your caution belongs. The mistake isn't being careful with the big stuff. The mistake is being equally careful and equally slow with the small reversible stuff that never needed that much caution in the first place, and that's where almost all the wasted time in most people's financial lives is actually hiding. How do I know I'm not just settling by taking the good enough option instead of holding out for something better? You don't with certainty, and that's exactly the point. The theoretical better option costs you something every single day you wait for it. The compounding of the good option you already turned down. Unless you have strong, specific evidence that a better option is genuinely close, not just possible somewhere out there in theory, holding out is usually the identity protection reason in disguise, dressed up as discernment. Good enough, taken now, compounding for 2 years, will beat theoretically perfect, taken never, every single time the math actually gets run. Let me address the objection I know is coming, but I've made fast decisions before and they blew up on me. Sure, that happens, but slow decisions blow up too. They just blow up quietly, disguised as opportunities that simply expired while you were thinking. Nobody posts about the business they didn't start, the investment they didn't make, the negotiation they didn't have, because it doesn't look like a failure. It just looks like nothing happened. But nothing happening, repeated for 10 years, is its own kind of failure, just a silent one that never shows up as a single bad headline, only as a decade of average results. And here's the part that should genuinely excite you. Decision speed is not a personality trait you're born with, like height. It's closer to a muscle, and muscles respond to training. You get faster at deciding the exact same way you get faster at anything else, by doing small versions of it repeatedly until your nervous system stops treating the decision like a threat. Start today with something low stakes. Pick a decision you've been sitting on for more than a week, something genuinely reversible, and give yourself 24 hours to make it. Not to be certain about it, just to make it. Then do that again next week with something slightly bigger. You are not trying to become reckless. You are trying to close the gap between the moment you know enough and the moment you finally act, because that gap, for most people, is measured in months and years, and it is the single most expensive gap in their entire financial life. Here's the sentence I want you to leave with. Every day you spend deliberating on a decision you already have enough information to make is a day you're paying full price for a delay that's earning you absolutely nothing in return. So look at whatever you've been sitting on. Ask yourself honestly whether it's reversible, and if it is, stop researching it and go make the call. Speed isn't the opposite of good judgment. For most people, at this point, it's the missing half of it. And if you want a way to actually measure this instead of just feeling vaguely inspired for the next 20 minutes, do this. Keep a running list for the next 30 days of every decision you catch yourself delaying past 24 hours. Just write the decision down, nothing else. At the end of the month, go back through that list and count how many of them were genuinely irreversible. My honest bet, based on watching this pattern play out over and over, is that the number will be somewhere close to zero. Almost everything you're sitting on can be undone, adjusted, or walked back if it goes wrong, which means almost everything on that list was never actually protected by your caution. It was just delayed by it. One more thing before you go. Notice I never once told you to be careless with money in this entire video. Everything here has a checkpoint built into it. The reversibility test, the failure conditions, the scheduled review. Fast and careful were never opposites. That's a false choice most people have never actually questioned. The opposite of fast isn't careful. The opposite of fast is stalled. And stalled has never once protected anyone's money. It's only ever delayed the moment they finally had to deal with the decision anyway, usually under worse conditions than the ones they started with. Fix that one gap between knowing enough and acting on it, and you will move through the next 5 years of your financial life at a completely different speed than the version of you watching this video right now.